last of the three topics we're going to get stuck into is SDLC requirements, user stories, and user acceptance testing. Now, this one is particularly important for people here who have aspirations to work in a lot of big tech companies, because this is a much more modern approach to requirements analysis. So, the backstory. I'll give you the really simple history. So, requirements engineering is it's an idea that has been around forever, right? You need to know what you're doing before you do it. You need to make sure you're knowing the right thing for the right reason, right? Classically, requirements engineering would exist in this way where people would do months of research and they'd produce a giant document that says, these are all the requirements you have to meet. And then people would get kind of lumped with it. What a lot of software companies in particular in the engineering space started to realize is that with this whole agile approach, where you are trying to be more dynamic and have a better dialogue with your consumers or your customers or your users, that requirements need to capture things in a bit more of a human way than just the phone shall be no bigger than this, and like think about requirements for a mobile phone, right? Say you're working for Samsung and it's like the phone needs to be no bigger than 4 inches tall and 2 inches wide and all of this stuff. But even if that's true, it's not really capturing the essence of why this is a requirement. And this is where user stories come in. It tries to humanize requirements a bit. So user stories are a method of requirements engineering. They're probably more an aspect of requirements engineering or an approach to it, to inform the development process of what features to build with the user at the center. And that's the critical part here, the user at the center of this process. So we don't want it to be some sterile process. We want it to be a very user-centric approach. So instead of requirements being something that's this whatever must be whatever. If you remember back when we talked in 7.1, there was this requirement on one of the slides which was the system shall keep the door locked at all times unless instructed otherwise by an authorized user, right? When the lock is disarmed. It's very specific, but it's cold. And the problem with cold requirements, cold as in not very affectionate and human, is that you're probably going to miss something, because the tragic reality of most software we build is as much as we like to be logical, efficient creatures, we are building things for emotional humans, right? Most humans are emotional. So you can't just neglect that. You can't just reduce the experience of people down to some perfect set of dot points that is the gospel without any problems, because you might be missing something. So the example I was trying to give here is when it comes to user stories, which are how we try and capture this in a more human way, instead of the requirements being, the phone has to be so big and so Tay, you should really write down all these little things you add. If you're bored, I'd love a list of them at the end of the course. That'd be hilarious. You don't have to, but that'd be funny. Instead of writing down, the phone has to be X inches tall and X inches wide and whatever, it's a user story might rather be, I want a phone that can fit in my pocket so that I don't have to hold it in my hand. Or I want a phone that can fit in my pocket without me noticing so that I don't feel heavy all day. Because kind of classic requirements analysis doesn't really encourage you to write things down so that you don't feel heavy, because how do you quantify that? That's not something that you could specify clearly. So there's a bit of an aim to capture these more human elements, and we do it in this structure. So the standard user story structure is you need to know the persona that you're dealing with, what you want to achieve, and then why. Right, and that why part is super important. So it's as a type of user, right? So when you're building a system say Microsoft Teams for UNSW, sometimes you have system admins using it, sometimes you have students, sometimes you have staff, right? These are all different types of people. So the most important thing not the most important, but the first thing when specifying a use a story is as a type of person, right? As a student, as a staff member, as a system admin. I want to achieve something, and this is why why I want to achieve it. So, rather than kind of writing down, a standard requirement might be like, you might specify a standard requirement as like, students can purchase monthly parking passes online, right? That might be like a standard requirement. You could write it as a user story instead, which is, as a student, I want to purchase a parking pass so that I can drive to school, or so that I don't have to catch the train, or so that I can drive to school. I can avoid the train to be less scared about COVID or something. Trying to capture what you can. So user stories are not an attempt to filter or sterilize or over formalize what people like want or feel, but rather a way to try and capture it quite concisely. And you should appreciate this because as software developers, oh god, I don't know, there's like this lost in translation client designer developer video. Oh god, there's this video that's been floating around LinkedIn. Oh, I'm gonna get drawing. Oh, if anyone knows. Oh, here we go. Beautiful. This one's been floating around my LinkedIn for a long time, which is like this whole joke about like trying to translate things. And this is actually a big problem in like big companies, right? Where the person, like in a small company, lots of people do the same things. But in a big company, which are most companies, someone might try and understand the user. They might go do these interviews, elicit this, and then they might write a requirement. And that requirement might get turned into something else and something else. And by the time someone's actually building a solution, you're really far from what you actually started with. As in, like, the solution doesn't satisfy that original customer, as in the wrong thing was built. Maybe the right way, maybe the wrong way, but the wrong thing was built. So one advantage of user stories is if you can capture and you can contain and maintain that original kind of vibe, if you will, in millennial speak, that the person with the problem's trying to convey, then if that same user story is handed down to various people, it's very easy to not lose track of what you're trying to do. So why do people want to park on campus? Is it because they want to get to campus quickly? Is it because they're scared of COVID? Is it because it's raining? Like, all of these details matter, and the more you can capture these human elements, the more likely you are to build the right thing. So this is a funny little video where they like just trying to translate things. So every time you hand information off to someone else, you're going to lose something in that translation process. This is people trying to like draw diagrams so that like, you feel how it feels on your back, and then you try and draw it out in front of you. And this is one of those dinky videos you see floating around LinkedIn and stuff, just so people can demonstrate a point dramatically. But I still think it's a cool little short video that, like, and this is what happens with a lot of engineering projects, is if you struggle to convey information between layers, sorry, the fish always makes me laugh. Then this is what you'll end up with. Okay, that was a little funnier than I remember. Okay, so that's what a user story is. It's simply a structure to write a requirement. It's still requirements engineering. It matters for the same reason requirements matter. It's just a different way to express requirements. I'll show you my corkboard if that's such a weird thing to say. I'll show you at the end if we have time. Sorry. I don't know why that's just a funny thing. You guys have worked with with the task board so far, right? Like you've used these boards for your projects, and to give you a better sense of where user stories fit in, I've got this diagram here that talks a little about, you have a product and then you have a series of epics and stuff, but it's a little bit agile speak, which I'm not like I'm not like super keen on in this particular term, just because we haven't talked about it much. But a way to understand user stories is they're basically just an alternative to tasks, or sometimes they're something that encapsulates a few tasks. So it'd be quite common that on a task board, instead of you writing down a to-do list that's like, I need to add, registration filtering for invalid inputs, you actually might put user stories on the task board that are like, as a user, I want to send a message to another user and be notified of it. So in that way, what will often happen in reality is that, just to maybe modify this diagram, this diagram's fine, but what will actually happen is that your user stories will often end up being broken up into smaller tasks. So you might have a user story that's like, I want to purchase a parking pass so that I can drive to school, but that might actually end up needing to be 5 or 6 different tasks to get that done. So a user story can encapsulate a little bit of a body of work. And in a perfect kind of like agile environment, you'd typically be building a product. You'd have these big chunks of work that maybe you're trying to do this whole month in Epic. All of those chunks of work might be described as user stories so that you understand the requirements you're working towards. And then from those stories, you'd extract more atomic tasks to actually get done on a weekly basis, for instance. But there's so many different models of how these approaches work that I couldn't possibly prescribe that to you in any more detail. User stories are often written in very non-technical language. They're not meant to be technical. They're not meant to include engineering details. If you want to have engineering details, you will typically specify those details in the underlying tasks. So, I mentioned before that user stories will generally be used to create more tasks. Usually the technical details will appear in those tasks rather than the user stories. And they're also goal-focused. It's not so much that you're trying to that's why the why is there. That's why that why part is really important, because it's back to that XY problem thing I mentioned. It's like, if a user says to you, like, I want to do this because of that, then as a developer or designer, you may come along and be like, oh, I see they want to achieve that. I see that they want to do that, but there might actually be another way to achieve that. I see that they want to do A to achieve some goal, but I think B might even be a better approach based on our current system. And this is good because now the user story allows you to build a dialogue where you can go back to, say, a product manager or someone that worked on the requirements and be like, we should go and let's go chat to someone about this. We should ask this question. I think there's an assumption here that we should challenge. And the user story is the facility in which these things can happen, because without it, it's harder to have those conversations. I've mentioned this a bunch of times already. We like user stories because it keeps it problem focused and because it makes it customer focused or user focused rather than something more sterile. We're not going to do the to-do list activity because I think there's some user stories activities in your tutes, and I think that's adequate. I think we added those recently, so this is probably not super useful, but this activity was more just going to be like, let's interview each other to figure out, if we're building a to-do list app, how does it need to function, right? And it's a good little activity that you could do. This is the kind of thing you might get asked in an exam, where it's like, write down a few user stories based on some pretend interviews you have. Like if someone said to you, like imagine you want a to-do list app and someone said to you, all right, I'm going to build you a to-do list app. Tell me what you want in it. Tell me what problem the to-do list app will solve for you. You could write down a series of user stories to capture those needs. So, yeah, and you can read more about user stories. Atlassian being a massive, agile, Kanban, all of this stuff, they have a lot of these articles on teamwork things, and you can read up about user stories in a lot more detail, thanks to Max Reckhoff. Yeah. And then last thing, which we can gloss through pretty quick, because this is useful but not like end of the world critical if you don't fully get your head around it, is just on validation. Because back on our requirements thing, user stories mainly help with analysis and specification, right? Like, you're still trying to extract information from your users or your stakeholders, and then you need to analyze and specify that. User stories and use cases are just ways of analyzing and specifying that, but you still need to actually validate your requirements, as in take your requirement specifications and go back to the user or stakeholder and make sure it's right. Whether you like I guess there's two ways you do this. Like, one is like initially when you write the requirements, you're going to like go back to them and be like, does this capture how you feel? You know, does this capture what you want? Like, is this a description of your problems? And then later, obviously, you're going to go through the other part, which is when you're writing tests or when you're doing testing of the built software system. If you actually give your users a solution, and you kind of say, you know, is this good? Is this what you expected? You know, like, I mean, this is true for anything, right? Like, so people say, oh, I want like an app upgrade, and then they do it, and then they take it back to the users and say, what do you think? And they get that feedback. So when you're testing user stories, though, one thing that's really important about writing user stories is making sure that you write them in a way that satisfies this INVEST acronym. Because while user stories are a little bit more open-ended, it is actually quite important that you get them right. And what that means is that they should all have these principles, or they should all have these aspects to them, right? And the first one is independent, right? So a user story should be an isolated piece of work that you could complete in independence from other pieces of work. It should be negotiable in terms of like, it shouldn't be too prescriptive or there be too much detail. Because if there's too much detail, you don't give developers room to move. And if you have too much detail, you know, you can risk getting it wrong. You can risk XY problem stuff. It needs to be valuable to the client. I mean, that one's kind of obvious. Estimable. This one I've stopped kind of getting into much detail about, but basically, someone should be able to look at a user story and be like, that's probably going to take 2 weeks. That's probably going to take 1 week. Like, you want to find a way where you can actually piece it into a picture. It shouldn't feel so grandiose and broad that you have no idea how to tie it into work. Because at the end of the day, these aren't just pieces of text. These are things that end up on people's desks that people getting paid have to complete. It should be small, right? Because the smaller, like, it's the same with commits and merge requests and tasks. It's like, the smaller the better for things, because then you can break it up and accomplish it in smaller pieces. That relates to independent. And then it should be testable. So back to that comment about my old boss from Microsoft. If it should be well enough defined that you can test it. So every time you write a user story, or any requirement for that matter, you should ask yourself, how would I test if this succeeded? And if you don't have an answer, then you should be very dubious about ever doing the work. You know, like that's a really important thing, because you'll see this a lot as you move into a lot of workplaces, is that people want to know if they spent the money right. Like, no one's going to pay you 2 weeks of salary, $4,000, to just do something that seems good and you have no idea how to know if it worked or not. So being testable is really important. One way that we make things testable is we write down what are called user acceptance criteria, UAC. And these are basically like, when you write down a user story, you'll also write down some conditions or criteria that need to be met. Basically it's like a checklist of things that if I check these boxes, then I've satisfied the user story. And you typically will write this like either at the requirement stage or before development, somewhere in between there, because it just like with iteration 1 and testing, you want to make sure that your user story as a requirement is testable before you go and build it. So here's an example. This is a user story. As a user, I want to use a search field to type a city, name, or street so that I can find matching hotel options, right? Airbnb, bookings.com, something like this. The user acceptance criteria for a user story like this might be that the search field is placed on the top bar, or an easy to find location. You could argue that that criteria might be a little too specific. That the search starts once the user clicks search. Sure. That the field contains a placeholder with grey color text, where are you going? And you can see that a lot of this stuff actually might not even happen at the requirement stage because it's quite specific. It might happen as like you get closer to building the feature and someone's designed something now or whatever. Like, again, I don't want to be too specific about it because it very much depends on the scenario. The main point is that before you write code, before you actually start building something, you typically want to have a checklist of things that you could tick off for a user story to say, yep, if all of these things are ticked off, then we've done our job. And sometimes they might go into a little bit more detail than the user story itself. Your acceptance criteria needs to balance being too broad with too narrow. You should try and minimize technical detail. There's obviously going to be a bit more technical detail in it than in user stories, as you probably saw on the previous slide. And I mean, this is the best description of it. It's like, this is kind of technical, right? Like, 200 symbols and placeholder, but it should still be understood by normal people. It shouldn't be like so technical that it's inaccessible. Yes, this is just a summary of things I've said already. I'm going to make a note of this slide. Sorry. So, when we talked about testing in week 3, we talked about unit testing, integration testing, system testing, and then user acceptance testing, which is where all this comes back to. User acceptance testing comes in a whole range of flavors and forms. Honestly, the most common type of user acceptance testing, the thing to check if like people's requirements are met, at the highest level, is actually just to get them to use the application you built. So user acceptance testing for most people actually would just consist of taking your UNSW dreams, putting it somewhere where someone can actually physically use it, and then getting them to fill in a survey or complete a checklist or, interview them and record the process or something like this. Like, they're often very manual things. There are parts of it that could be automated if you had some really smart tests, like some really smart user interface tests and stuff, but in general, I think it's better just for you to assume that they're automated. HDSQ says, hang on, so are all black box tests also acceptable tests? Acceptance tests, sorry? Not really. It's like, there's like acceptance tests, system tests, integration tests, and unit tests. And it's like, then there's like black box and white box tests. And it's like, you can apply black box or white box testing to any of those layers. Most things are black box tests though. So it's not so much like, are all black box tests also acceptance tests? It's more like pretty much all acceptance tests are also black box tests. That's kind of the flow of that. Yep, here's another example of UAC, user acceptance criteria. As a user, I can log in through social media account because I always forget my passwords. That's a great user story. This is such a critical piece of information. Like, understanding why people want to do this is so valuable. Because they forget their passwords. Okay, and then the user acceptance criteria might be that they can log in through Facebook, that they can log in through LinkedIn, and they can log in through Twitter. Another way to write acceptance criteria, so the way we've kind of written acceptance criteria here is just like a series of dot points generally. But another way to write it is what we call like behavior or like scenario-oriented acceptance criteria. Rule-based, I call this behavior because you're describing someone's behavior. And rather than just writing like a list of dot points, you're a bit more structured in it, and you actually say, given a precondition, when something happens, then this result occurs. So, for instance, if you have a user story here that's like, as a user, I want to be able to recover the password to my account so that I'll be able to access the account in case I forgot my password. You could actually write, some scenario-based ones here, saying, given that the user's navigated to the login page, when the user selects forgot password, and they've entered an email to receive the link for password recovery, then the system sent the link to the entered email, right? So this is another way of writing acceptance criteria. This one is a lot more useful when you're trying to describe things that are maybe a bit more complicated, like use cases, because that's kind of all this is as well, right? You're simply trying to describe some kind of flow or dialogue that's more complicated than just they can log in with Facebook, they can log in with Twitter, they can log in with LinkedIn. You can use whatever acceptance criteria you want. There's no real like good or bad one. Most of this stuff is pretty broad. It's like the only thing we hope for people to take away from this is that user stories have this structure, and then user stories will typically need some kind of dot points or sub points that describe, it just describes in a bit more detail how to tell if you actually succeeded with that. So yeah, that's pretty straightforward. Any questions about that? Otherwise, that's pretty much everything on user stories. And I have another poll for you all. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll finish this one up. Okay, cool. All right.